She pulled on the gray dress with the torn hem because she had nothing left that wasn't mended twice over, and she walked into that parlor with her chin high, even though her hands were rough as saddle leather and her boots left dust on the clean floor. She didn't know the man standing by the window had ridden 3 days from the mountains to meet her father, and she didn't know he already owned every acre of land her family had worked for 20 years. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1884 came to Harrow Flats, Wyoming, like a punishment. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Calloway property had dropped to a thin ribbon by the middle of June, and by July, it was barely a mud line cutting through cracked red earth. The grass in the lower pasture had gone yellow and brittle. 3 of the neighboring ranches had already sold. 2 more were in negotiations with men who came from Denver and Salt Lake City, carrying leather satchels and polished boots that had never once touched real soil. Clara Calloway had watched all of it from the back of a gray mare named June, riding the fence lines every morning before the heat became unbearable, checking water troughs, counting heads, listening to the land, the way her grandfather had taught her before he passed. Her grandfather had said the land talks if you're willing to be quiet enough to hear it. Clara was always quiet enough. She was 26 years old, the eldest daughter of Gerald Calloway, and she had spent the last 4 years managing the working side of the ranch while her father managed what he called the business side, which meant he sat in town 3 days a week talking to men in the saloon and came home smelling of whiskey and worry in equal measure. Clara didn't resent her father. She understood him. Gerald Calloway was a man built for a different era, one where a handshake meant something and the land did the rest of the work on its own. The world had changed around him, and he hadn't found the words to say so out loud yet, but Clara knew the numbers. She kept them in a ledger she hid under the floorboard in her room, because if her father saw the full picture written down in ink, she was afraid it would break something in him that couldn't be fixed. They owed $1,100 to the Territorial Bank. They had 4 months before the note came due. And the dry summer had cut their saleable cattle count by nearly a third. She had been working through the arithmetic every night by lamplight, looking for a solution she hadn't found yet, when her father came home on the second Tuesday of July with news that changed everything. "We're having a guest," Gerald said. He set his hat on the peg by the door and didn't look at her directly, which was always the sign that something complicated was coming. "He arrives Thursday." "Who?" Clara asked. She was at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, working through a harness repair that couldn't wait for the saddleman in town. "Nathan Holt." Clara set down the leather strap. "The Nathan Holt." There's only one. She had heard the name, the way everyone in Harrow Flats had heard it in pieces, in fragments passed across fence lines and over coffee at the general store. Nathan Holt was a mountain man, people said. He'd made his money in cattle and timber and land, and he'd done it without a partner and without apology. He owned range in 3 territories. He ran his operation from somewhere up in the high country, a ranch so far into the Rockies that most people had never seen it, only heard about it. I was also, according to the whispers Clara had collected over the years, the man who held the primary note on most of the land in Harrow Flats, including theirs. "He's coming here," she said, making sure she understood. "To this house, to discuss the property," Gerald said. He finally looked at her, and his eyes had that particular shade of tired in them that she'd been watching deepen for 2 years. "He's been sending letters through his solicitor. I figured it was time to meet the man face to face." "What does he want?" "I don't know yet, Clara. That's why he's coming." She picked the harness back up. Her hands were steadier than her thoughts. "I'll prepare the guest room," she said. "I already asked your sister to do that. Then I'll make sure there's food worth eating." Gerald nodded and moved toward the hallway, and then he stopped. Without turning around, he said, "I'd like you to dress appropriately when he arrives. First impressions matter." Clara looked at her rolled sleeves and the harness grease on her right wrist. She didn't say anything. Her father went to bed early the way he always did when something frightened him. Clara stayed up until midnight. Chatang. Her sister Violet was 17 and beautiful in the way that small towns noticed soft features, pale skin, hair that curled naturally at the temples, the kind of girl that men tipped their hats to automatically. Violet knew this about herself without arrogance, the way a person knows they have a talent for music or numbers. It was simply a fact she had organized her life around. "He's rich," Violet said. Thursday morning, arranging her hair at the mirror in the room they still shared despite Clara's protests that she was nearly 27 and deserved her own space. "Harriet Drum said he's worth more than the whole county put together." "Harriet Drum says a lot of things," Clara said. She was pulling on stockings, seated at the edge of her narrow bed. "She also said he's never married, not once." Violet met her eyes in the mirror. Imagine that. A man like that never married. A man like that is probably too busy counting his acres to court anyone. Or too particular. Violet smiled. Men with that kind of money get to be particular. Clara stood and reached for the dress hanging on the peg behind the door. It was gray, not the fashionable pearl gray that city women wore, but the honest working gray of a dress that had been washed so many times the original color was a memory. The hem had been let out once and then mended when it tore, and the cuffs were plain because the lace had gone threadbare and she'd removed it rather than leave it looking shabby. It was the best dress she owned. Violet turned around from the mirror. "You're not wearing that." "It's clean." "Clara. It fits." "It's—" Violet stopped, pressed her lips together. "Father said to make a good impression." "I'm not trying to impress anyone," Clara said. "I'm trying to get through a dinner without embarrassing our family. There's a difference." She smoothed the front of the gray dress with both hands. The fabric was thin from age, but it held its shape. She'd ironed it herself that morning before the heat built up. Violet turned back to the mirror and didn't say anything else. Clara went downstairs to start the biscuits. Nathan Holt arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon. Clara heard the horses from the kitchen and wiped her hands on her work apron before she remembered she was still wearing it, pulled it off, folded it over the back of a chair, and walked to the front of the house just as her father was opening the door. She stood in the hallway and she looked at the man standing on their porch. He was not what she had expected. She wasn't entirely sure what she had expected, something harder maybe. Something that looked more like money. The men who came from Denver in their leather satchels always had a particular quality about them, a kind of careful grooming that announced itself before they spoke. They wore their wealth on the surface. Nathan Holt wore a battered trail coat and riding boots that were clean but clearly used. He was tall, genuinely tall. The kind of height that came from the mountains, and not from posture, with dark hair that had been cut recently enough to be decent, and a jaw that carried a few days of dark beard without looking careless. He held his hat in both hands, which she noticed because most men kept their hats on indoors unless someone reminded them. He shook her father's hand. His grip was brief and solid, and he didn't pump it the way men did when they were performing confidence. He was just a man shaking another man's hand. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His voice was low, the kind that didn't need to push to be heard. "I appreciate the invitation." "Please," Gerald said, stepping back. "Come in, come in." Nathan Holt stepped across the threshold, and his eyes moved through the front room the way experienced eyes move, not prying, just reading. He looked at the furniture and the floors and the walls, and Clara understood that he was seeing the same things she saw every day. The chair with the cracked leg propped with a folded piece of wood, the rug worn thin in the path between the door and the parlor, the curtains bleached pale by years of afternoon sun. Then his eyes found her. She was standing 6 feet away in a gray dress with a mended hem, her hair pinned up practically and not artfully, her hands clasped in front of her because she didn't know what else to do with them. She did not look away. Nathan Holt did not look away either. "My daughter Clara," Gerald said, moving his hand in her direction with a vague gesture. "She keeps the house running, and this is—" He turned toward the parlor doorway where Violet had appeared in a pale blue dress that suited her exactly. "Violet, my younger girl." Violet smiled. It was a beautiful smile, and she deployed it perfectly, stepping forward with her hand extended. "Mr. Holt, we've heard so much about you." Nathan took her hand briefly and nodded. "Miss Calloway." Then his gaze returned to Clara. "Miss Calloway," he said again, with the same tone, making no distinction. "Mr. Holt," Clara said. Her voice came out even. She was glad. Your father tells me you manage the property operations. Someone has to, she said, and immediately wondered if that sounded bitter. She hadn't meant it to, it was simply the truth. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like a recognition. Yes, he said. Someone does. Dinner was not a comfortable event. Clara had made beef and potatoes and biscuits and a dried apple pie, because that was what the pantry allowed, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She set the table correctly and made sure everything was hot when it was served, and she sat at the far end from where Nathan Holt sat beside her father. Gerald was performing. Clara could see at the particular posture her father used when he was trying to seem larger than he felt, the way he talked about the ranch in its best possible terms. The summer of 1881, when the cattle numbers had been strong, the acreage in the north pasture that had always produced good grass. Nathan Holt listened. He ate without complaint, and he listened, and he asked questions that were simple on the surface and not simple underneath. What's your water situation looking like this year? He asked. Gerald waved a hand. We've had better summers, no question, but the creek's been dropping since April, Clara said. Her father looked at her. Nathan Holt looked at her. It's lost about 60% of its usual flow, she continued, because she had started and stopping now would be worse. The east trough is holding, but the main source for the south pasture is going to be critical by August if we don't see rain. A small silence. And you don't expect rain, Nathan Holt said. It wasn't a question. Not before September, she said. The patterns haven't been right. Clara watches the weather close, Gerald said with a tone that was somewhere between pride and embarrassment. She's always had a head for the land. That's a useful thing to have, Nathan Holt said. He looked at Clara with a steady directness that she wasn't used to from men she'd just met. Most men, when they looked at her, were looking past her, or through her, or at whatever they'd already decided she was. What would you do about the water situation if it was your decision? The question landed on the table like something solid. Violet looked up from her plate. Gerald set down his fork. Clara took a breath. There's a spring on the upper north ridge, she said. It runs year-round. I know because I tracked it 2 winters ago during the dry season. If we ran a line, not a big operation, just gravity-fed pipe down the slope, it would feed the south pasture trough and take the pressure off the creek. The cost would be under $200 in materials if we did the labor ourselves. And the labor? 2 men and 3 weeks. I've already mapped the route. Nathan Holt looked at her for a moment that was 1 beat longer than a polite moment. Then he nodded slowly. That's a sound idea, he said. Gerald laughed a little too loudly. She's always got ideas. Clara's the thinker, Violet's the beauty. He smiled at Violet, who smiled back because that was her role and she played it graciously. Nathan Holt did not laugh. He looked at Clara again. She met his gaze and held it and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't come out wrong. After dinner, the men moved to the front porch to talk. Clara cleared the table. Violet helped for approximately 4 minutes and then disappeared, which was her custom. Clara was rinsing plates at the basin when she heard her father's voice through the window, quieter than it had been at dinner, carrying the particular weight of a man who was out of options. I want to keep it, Gerald was saying. That's what I want you to understand. It's been Calloway land for 22 years. My father-in-law broke this ground. I buried my wife here. She stopped moving. Let the water go still. Nathan Holt's voice was lower. She had to concentrate to catch it. I understand that, Gerald. I'm not here to take anything. I'm here because I want to know if this land is worth preserving. Worth preserving. Her father said it back like he was testing the flavor of it. A man can own 1,000 acres of dead land. That's just a number on a document. What I'm interested in is land that's working. Land with someone who understands it. A pause. You've got that. The question is whether you've got the resources to hold it through this drought. If I had a better year? You need more than a better year, Gerald. Silence. Clara pressed her knuckles against the edge of the basin and breathed slowly. What are you her father asked. I'm not proposing anything tonight, Nathan Holt said. I rode 3 days to look at this land and talk to the people running it. I'll make a decision after I've seen more. And if you decide it's not worth your time. Another pause. When Nathan Holt spoke again, Clara had to strain to hear him. Let's cross that creek when we get to it. She heard the porch creak as one of them shifted weight. Then her father said in a voice that had gone small and tired, She's the one who keeps it going, you know. Clara. She's the one who actually knows this land. Clara stared at the basin. She had never heard her father say that out loud before, not once in 4 years. I know, Nathan Holt said. He stayed 3 days. On the first morning, Clara was up at dawn the way she always was, and she found him already outside standing at the fence line of the east pasture, looking at the cattle with his hat in his hand, and the early light coming over the ridge behind him. She almost went back inside. Almost. Instead, she walked out and stood beside him at the fence. You're up early, she said. Always have been. He didn't look at her. He was watching a particular heifer who was moving slower than the rest of the herd, favoring her left rear leg. That one's been limping for a while. 3 days, Clara said. I've been monitoring her. It's not the joint I checked. More likely a thorn or a stone bruise. I've been putting her in the near pasture to keep her off rough ground. He nodded, still watching the heifer. You handle that yourself. My father doesn't do the early rounds. And the hired hands? She paused. We had 2. We let them go in April to manage the payroll. It's been me since then. He turned and looked at her fully for the first time that morning. In the dawn light, she was aware of the gray dress again. She'd changed into her work clothes, canvas trousers, and a pale linen shirt, because she wasn't going to ride fence in the dinner dress, and she was aware that her hair was just braided back because there was no point in doing anything else with it before a morning's work. She looked back at him without apology. You're running this whole operation by yourself, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to astonishment held very still. Mostly, she said. Why? The question surprised her. Not because it was inappropriate, but because no one had ever asked it directly. Most people either assumed she had no choice, or assumed she secretly wanted the burden. Because it's my family's land, she said. And because if I don't, nobody else will. I was quiet for a moment. A morning bird started up somewhere in the grass behind the barn. The heifer in the pasture lowered her head to graze, moving slowly, but moving. Show me the North Ridge, he said. The spring you mentioned at dinner. She looked at him. I'd like to see the route you mapped, he said. If you're willing. She was willing. They rode the North Ridge that morning, just the 2 of them, and she showed him what she'd found, the spring that came out from between 2 limestone shelves and ran cold and clean, even in the driest. August, the natural grade that ran back toward the south pasture, the places where a gravity-fed line could be anchored without major excavation. He asked questions the whole way. Real questions, not the kind designed to show off or challenge, but the kind a person asks when they genuinely want to understand something. He asked about the soil and the rock layer, and whether the spring output stayed consistent or varied by season, and she answered everything she knew, and told him plainly when she didn't know something. At the top of the ridge they stopped and looked down at the Calloway land spread below them, the dry creek cutting its thin line through it, the ranch buildings small in the distance. My grandfather always said this valley was going to be important someday, Clara said. She hadn't meant to say it. It just came out sitting there on June's back, with the summer air thin and bright around her. He said the land here was the kind that remembers water, that if you treat it right, it comes back. You believe that? Nathan asked. He was looking at the valley, not at her. I don't know, she said. I believe he believed it. And he knew land better than anyone I've ever met. She paused. He also said that the people who stay on a piece of ground long enough start to belong to it, whether they own the paper or not. Nathan turned his head and looked at her. She realized what she'd said, and what he might take it to mean, that she was making some kind of appeal, some kind of claim. That wasn't what she'd meant. Or maybe it was. She wasn't sure. I'm not trying to argue ownership, she said quickly. I know what the banknote says. I know you're not, he said. He looked back at the valley. My family's land is up in the mountain range north of here, he said. My father built the first structure there when I was 4 years old. My mother died there. My younger brother. He said it plainly without self-pity, the way a person states a fact they've had a long time to make peace with. I know what it means when land has history in it. Clara didn't say anything. She understood that sometimes silence is the right answer. They rode back down in a quiet that felt like mutual respect, which was something she hadn't expected from this visit, and didn't quite know what to do with. On the second day, 3 men from town came by in the mid-morning. Clara was in the barn, working on the water line proposal. She'd laid out her mapped route on a piece of oilskin, working through the materials list with a stub of pencil, when she heard voices outside, and recognized one of them as belonging to Denton Graves, who ran the feed store in Harrow Flats, and also sat on the Provisional Council, and generally considered himself to be a man whose opinion mattered more than it actually did. She came out of the barn and found Nathan standing in the yard with Graves and 2 other men she knew by sight. Ranchers from the south end of the county who had sold out the previous winter. Graves had his thumbs in his vest pockets, which was his posture for delivering pronouncements. Just saying, Holt, there are better investments in this valley than the Calloway place. Couple of properties with stronger water rights better. I appreciate the counsel, Nathan said. He was relaxed, one hand on the fence post, the way a man stands when he's not particularly threatened by what he's hearing. You'd be taking on a failing operation, Graves pressed, and a woman running it, which... He caught sight of Clara coming out of the barn and had the decency to pause, if not the decency to stop. Well, it's an unconventional situation. Miss Calloway. Nathan looked over at her as she approached. Do you want to tell these gentlemen about the spring on the North Ridge, or should I? She stopped beside him, not behind him, beside him, and looked at Graves. There's a year-round spring on the upper north property line, she said. With a gravity-fed water line, it would supply the south pasture through any drought this county's likely to see in the next 20 years. I've already mapped the installation route and calculated the materials cost. She looked at Graves steadily. The Calloway land doesn't have a water problem. It has an infrastructure problem. Those are different things. Graves looked from her to Nathan and back to her. A woman can know a piece of land as well as any man, Nathan said. His voice was mild, but there was nothing mild underneath it. Sometimes better. In my experience, the person who actually works the ground knows it better than the person who reads a surveyor's report. He nodded at Graves with the specific politeness that is its own form of dismissal. I'll keep your suggestions in mind. The 3 men left. Clara stood in the yard after they'd gone and looked at the dust their horses raised on the road. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know I didn't have to, Nathan said. I wanted to. She looked at him. He was looking at the road the way she was. You didn't ask me first, she said. No, he agreed. I should have. My apologies. She had not expected an apology. She turned it over in her mind, examining it. What I said to them was true, she said finally. It's not that I needed someone to say it for me. I know it's true, he said. That's why I said it. She didn't fully know what to do with Nathan Holt. Most men either dismissed her completely or treated her with a kind of exaggerated courtesy that was really just a different form of dismissal. Nathan did neither. He listened when she spoke and looked at her when she spoke and treated what she said as information worth having. It was a peculiar thing to get used to. On the second evening, her father asked Nathan directly. Clara was not in the room, but she heard it through the thin wall between the parlor and the kitchen, where she was making the breakfast preparations for the following morning, because mornings came fast, and it was better to be ready. I need to know what you're thinking, Gerald said. A man my age doesn't have time for long negotiations. Then I'll be direct, Nathan said. The land is sound. The water problem has a solution. The livestock numbers are low, but recoverable. The operation has been held together by someone who knows what she's doing. A pause. What it needs is capital. A real investment, not a delay on a debt. What kind of investment are you talking about? A partnership, Nathan said. Not a buyout. A working arrangement where the operation expands the debt is restructured on terms that make sense for actual agriculture, and the people who know this land stay on it and run it. Clara set down the bowl she was holding. "You'd be a silent partner?" Gerald asked. "I'd be an engaged one," Nathan said. "But the operational decisions stay with the people who've earned the right to make them." Another pause. "I believe that's how it should work." She heard her father's chair creak. "Clara would have to agree," Gerald said. "She won't do anything she doesn't believe in. I learned that about her the hard way." "I'd expect nothing less," Nathan said. "I'd want to speak to her about it directly." Clara stood very still in the kitchen, with her hands around a cold bowl, and her heart doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. She had been managing this land alone for 4 years. She had run the numbers and ridden the fence lines and sat up at night with the ledger and the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. And not once had anyone, not her father, not a neighbor, not a banker, looked at what she had done and said that it was worth preserving. Nathan Holt was looking at her work and saying it was the reason the land was worth saving. She set the bowl down carefully and went back to her preparations. She was not going to let herself feel something about this man yet. She had learned over 26 years of being the practical one that feelings were expensive when you were the person everything depended on. But she was aware with a clarity that was almost frightening that something had shifted in the last 2 days that she didn't know how to shift back. He came to find her the following morning, the last morning of his visit, before the horses were saddled for his ride back to the mountains. She was at the water trough checking the level, her back to the main house, when she heard his boots on the dry ground behind her. "I owe you a direct conversation," he said, coming to stand a few feet away. "My father talked to you last night," she said. It wasn't a question. "He did. And I told him any arrangement depends on your agreement, not just your father's signature." He paused. "This land is working because of you. It would be dishonest of me to make any decision about it without talking to you first." She turned around. He was holding his hat the way he'd been holding it when he arrived 3 days ago, and the morning sun was full on his face, and he looked like a man who was saying exactly what he meant without decoration. "What are you actually proposing?" she asked. "Capital for the water line and a livestock rebuild," he said. "Debt restructuring on the banknote at a rate that makes agricultural sense instead of banker sense. A 5-year working partnership with operational decisions remaining with the Calloway family." He paused. "And a conversation every season between me and the person who actually runs this place, so I understand what the land is doing." Clara looked at him. "Why?" she said. "Because it's good land," he said. "And because the person managing it is worth the investment." She was quiet for a moment. A warm wind came off the ridge and moved through the grass in the lower pasture with a dry whispering sound. "You don't know me," she said. "I've spent 3 days watching how you work," he said. "That tells me more than most people let me know in a year. And if I disagree with a decision you want to make, then we talk it through until one of us is persuaded," he said, "or until we find a third answer. And if neither of us is persuaded..." Something genuine moved across his face. "Then I trust the person who knows the ground," he said. "I've learned that much." Clara Calloway had spent 4 years being the invisible one, the practical daughter, the capable one, the one who kept everything running while everyone else talked about what should happen to the land. She worked every single day with her own hands. She had worn a gray dress with a mended hem to meet this man, because it was all she had, and she had walked into that parlor, expecting to be looked past the way she always was. Nathan Holt had looked at her, not at what she could offer him, or what she represented, or what might be gained from her position. He had looked at her, and he had seen someone worth talking to. That was not nothing. That was in fact more than most people had given her in 26 years. She looked at him steadily in the morning light with the heat already building in the sky above the ridge, and the dry summer pressing down on everything that needed water and patience, and the willingness to work. "I want the terms in writing," she said. "I'd expect nothing less," Nathan Holt said. And he almost smiled. The terms came in writing just as Clara had asked. Nathan Holt's solicitor rode out from town 8 days after Nathan returned to the mountains, carrying a folded document that was 3 pages long and written in plain language. Not the kind of legal phrasing that hides what it means, but the kind that says exactly what it intends. Clara read it twice at the kitchen table, while the solicitor sat across from her drinking coffee, and her father stood by the window, pretending not to be anxious. The terms were what Nathan had described. Capital for the waterline, debt restructuring, a 5-year working partnership, operational decisions remaining with the Calloway family, a quarterly meeting in person between Nathan and the person running the operation. Her name was in the document. Not her father's name. Hers. Clara Calloway, Ranch Manager, Calloway Property, Red Pine Creek, Wyoming Territory. She had to read it a second time to be sure she hadn't misread it the first time. He specified you by name, the solicitor said in a tone that suggested this was unusual enough to note. Mr. Holt was particular about that. Gerald Calloway cleared his throat. Well, he said, that's Clara. She picked up the pen the solicitor had set beside the inkwell. She signed her name. Then she pushed the document toward her father, and he signed his, and then it was done, and the solicitor folded the pages and tucked them back into his satchel with the efficient movements of a man who had witnessed many such moments and knew better than to comment on them. After he left, Gerald stood in the kitchen and looked at his daughter across the table with an expression she didn't have a clean word for. He's a serious man, Gerald said finally. Yes, Clara said. Gerald started again. I want you to know I'm aware, Clara, of what you've been carrying. I don't say it enough. She looked at her father, at the lines around his eyes, and the gray at his temples, and the way his shoulders had started to curve inward over the last 2 years. The way a man's body shows what he hasn't said out loud. I know, Papa, she said. It was enough. It was for the moment more than enough. She went back to work. The first load of materials for the waterline arrived the following week on a freight wagon driven by a man named Boone, who was broad through the shoulders and economical with words, and who climbed down from the wagon, looked at the oilskin map Clara unrolled in front of him and said, All right, show me where you want to start. His name was Boone Aldridge, and he'd come recommended by Nathan's ranch operation in the mountains, and he knew what he was doing with pipe and grade, and the physics of moving water from high ground to low. He and Clara worked well together immediately, not warmly, not with any particular friendship, but with the clean efficiency of two people who both understood the task and had no interest in pretending otherwise. They started at the spring on the North Ridge and worked their way down. The days were brutal. The summer had found its peak heat, and it pressed down on everything without apology. Clara was up before dawn every morning and on the ridge by the time the sun came over the eastern rim, working the trenching and the pipe connections and the anchor points, while Boone handled the heavier excavation. Her hands, already roughened from 4 years of solo ranch work, developed a new set of calluses by the end of the first week. Violet watched from a distance, the way Violet always watched, with a combination of admiration and puzzlement that she sometimes voiced and sometimes kept to herself. You could let the man do more of it, Violet said one evening, coming to sit on the fence rail where Clara was reviewing the next day's section of route. He does his share, Clara said without looking up. That's not what I mean. Clara looked up. I mean, you don't have to be the one doing the hardest parts, Violet said. You don't always have to prove yourself. Clara held her sister's gaze for a moment. I'm not proving anything, Vi. I'm building a waterline. Violet tucked a curl behind her ear. I just don't want you to wear yourself down to nothing. I won't. You always say that, and I'm always still here in the morning. She softened it with something that was almost a smile. I'm fine. Go inside before the mosquitoes find you. Violet went inside. Clara went back to the route map. She didn't tell Violet that she woke at 3 in the morning twice that week, with her hands cramping and her shoulders burning, and a cold certainty sitting in her chest that if anything went wrong with this waterline, if the spring flow wasn't what she calculated, if the grade was off, if the materials failed, she would have traded her family's debt for a bigger problem, and Nathan Holt's name on a partnership document that would turn into something ugly. She didn't tell anyone that. She just worked faster. Denton Graves came by on a Thursday. He came alone this time, which was different from the first visit, and he came in the mid-afternoon when he must have known that Gerald Calloway was typically in town. He rode up to the yard and dismounted with the particular ease of a man who considers himself welcome everywhere he goes. Clara was at the barn. She came out when she heard the horse. "Miss Calloway," Graves said. He had a pleasant face when he wanted to use it that way. "I was hoping to find your father." "He's in town," she said. "Pity." He looked at her the way he always looked at her, not dismissively exactly, but with the specific quality of attention a man gives to something he's cataloging rather than actually seeing. "I heard you've got a work crew up on the ridge. Holt's project." "The Calloway Ranches project," she said. "Mr. Holt provided capital." Graves nodded slowly, hooking his thumbs in his vest. "Interesting arrangement. A woman managing a project of that scale." "The project is moving on schedule," she said. "Is there something you needed, Mr. Graves?" "Just a friendly call." He smiled. "I wanted to make sure your family understands the other options still on the table. There are buyers. Miss Calloway. Serious ones. Men who'd take this property off your hands at a fair price and let you—" "The property isn't for sale," she said. "Your father might see it differently." "My father signed a partnership agreement 2 weeks ago," she said. "The land isn't a question anymore." Graves was quiet for a moment. The pleasant expression didn't leave his face, but something underneath it went hard. "Holt's a mountain man," he said. "He runs operations from a distance and then moves on when the numbers don't work. You're betting your family's home on a man you met 3 days ago." Clara looked at him steadily. She had grown up knowing Denton Graves, and she had learned over the years that he was not a malicious person in the simple sense. He was the more complicated kind, a man who genuinely believed his version of events was the correct one, which made him harder to argue with than someone who knew he was wrong. "Thank you for the concern," she said. "I'll tell my father you came by." Graves stood a moment longer the way men stand when they're not used to being concluded. Then he tipped his hat not warmly and mounted up and rode back toward town. Clara watched him go. She went back into the barn and stood very still for a moment, because Graves hadn't said anything. She hadn't already thought herself at 3 in the morning, with her hands cramping. Then she picked up her tools and went back to work. The letter arrived in the 3rd week of July. It came addressed to Gerald Calloway from the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne, and her father brought it home from town with a gray look on his face that she recognized from the bad seasons when she was younger. She read it at the kitchen table while Gerald stood by the door. The bank was not honoring the debt restructuring that Nathan's agreement implied. The letter was polite and formal, and it said in the particular language banks use when they want to be clear, without being obvious, that the original note terms were still in effect, that no modification had been formally recorded with their office, and that the full amount of $1,100 plus accumulated interest was due by the 1st of October, 6 weeks away. Clara set the letter down. "Did Nathan know about this?" she asked. "I don't know," Gerald said. "His solicitor said." "I know what the solicitor said." She stood up. "I need to send a wire." "Clara." "I need to send a wire to Nathan Holt," she said. "Today." She wrote it herself. She kept it short because wires cost by the word, and she was not going to spend money on words that weren't necessary. She stated the facts, the bank letter, the date, the amount, the discrepancy with the partnership terms. She asked for clarification. She signed it with her name. She rode into town and sent it from the telegraph office, and rode back home, and did not tell Violet what was happening, because Violet would panic in the specific way that was not useful, and she did not say anything more to her father, because Gerald had already reached his limit, and pushing past it would help no one. She made supper. She made it well because eating helped and routine helped, and the thing about bad news was that you still had to eat. And then she sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the partnership document and the ledger, and she worked through every possible interpretation of what was happening. The most charitable interpretation was that Nathan's solicitor had filed the restructuring paperwork and the bank hadn't processed it yet. Administrative delay. It happened. The less charitable interpretation was that something had gone wrong at Nathan's end, a miscommunication and oversight. The interpretation she would not let herself sit with for more than 30 seconds at a time was the one where Nathan Holt had known about the bank situation all along, and had used a partnership agreement as a means to buy time while the original debt matured. She would not believe that. But she was aware that she was choosing not to believe it, which was different from having evidence that it wasn't true. She stayed up until midnight. The reply came the next morning. Nathan's wire was 6 words long. I am coming. Do not worry. Clara stared at it for a long moment in the telegraph office, while the operator looked at his desk with the professional discretion of a man who read other people's wires all day and had learned not to react. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She was not sure whether 6 words was reassuring, or whether it was exactly the kind of thing a man said when he was coming to deliver bad news in person because he had the decency not to do it by wire. She rode home. She told her father Nathan was coming. Gerald sat down heavily in his chair and nodded and didn't say much. She went back to the water line because the water line didn't stop for financial crises, and the pipe connections on the upper section needed to be sealed before the next workday, and Boone was waiting on her to confirm the anchor points. She spent the afternoon on the North Ridge doing precise, demanding physical work in brutal heat, and she was grateful for every minute of it because it gave her something to be capable at while everything else felt uncertain. Nathan arrived the following afternoon. He looked like a man who had ridden hard and not slept much, and he came into the yard without ceremony and found Clara at the fence line of the east pasture and said, I have an explanation. I'd like one, she said. He told her. The bank, he said, had a local representative, a man named Ferris, who sat on the same provisional council as Denton Graves, and who had declined to process the restructuring paperwork on a procedural technicality that Nathan's solicitor was describing as bad faith. The technicality was real enough to require a legal response, but thin enough that any honest territorial judge would dismiss it without deliberation. His attorney was filing the challenge in Cheyenne within the week. The bank is working with Graves, Clara said. It wasn't a question. The pieces had been fitting themselves together in her mind for 24 hours. I believe so, Nathan said. He looked at her directly the way he always did. I won't pretend I saw this coming, Clara. I should have had the restructuring recorded at 2 offices instead of 1. That's my error. She appreciated that he called it his error without making her ask. What's the timeline? She said. 3 weeks for the legal challenge. The bank can't move on the note while a challenge is active. Territorial law is clear on that. We have time. 3 weeks, she repeated. 3 weeks, he confirmed. She looked at the east pasture. The heifer with the stone bruise was walking normally, now had been for 5 days. Small victories accumulated. And if the legal challenge doesn't succeed, she asked, then I pay the note directly and we restructure informally, he said. The land doesn't go. I want to be clear about that. The land does not go. The way he said it, flat, without drama, the way a man states a thing he has already decided, did something to the tightness in her chest that had been sitting there for 36 hours. She breathed out slowly. All right, she said. All right, he said. I believe you, she said. That's all right. He held her gaze for a moment. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, she said. If the legal challenge fails and you have to pay the note directly, I want an adjustment to the partnership terms, more favorable to the family's equity position. He almost smiled. Of course you do. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's exactly what I'd want someone in your position to say. He stayed again. 4 days this time. And the 4 days were different from the first 3 because the first visit had been a negotiation, and this one was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name yet, but that Clara was aware of every time he came to find her on the ridge or at the water trough or at the fence line, which he did every morning without being asked. He worked. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She had expected a man of Nathan Holt's resources to observe and advise. Instead, he showed up at the North Ridge on the second morning with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up and asked Boone what needed doing. And Boone, who was not a man easily impressed, looked him over once and handed him a shovel. Clara watched Nathan Holt dig a trench anchor for a gravity pipe in the July heat, without complaint, without posturing, without any of the performance that men usually brought to manual labor when they wanted to be seen doing it. He just did the work. She was deeply unsettled by how much she respected that. At the end of the second day, they sat on the ridge at the edge of evening, after Boone had ridden back to town, and the day's work was finished, and the valley was spread below them, going golden, and the heat was finally breaking a little in the high air. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "I'll tell you if I'm not going to answer. What happened to your family?" She paused. "Your father mentioned you had—" She stopped, realized she was confusing sources. "You mentioned your mother and your brother, the mountain property." He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just gathering the right words the way a careful person does. "The winter of '78, he said. "Blizzard came fast the way they do in the high country. I was in Laramie on business. By the time I got back—" He paused. "My mother had gone quickly. My brother lasted 3 days." He said it in the same plain way he'd said it before, not armored, just resolved. "I wasn't there." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "It changed the way I think about what matters," he said. "Money is a tool. I understand that better now than I did before. It can do a great deal, and it can't do the thing you actually want it to do when the moment comes." "And what did you want it to do?" He turned and looked at her. "Bring me back in time," he said simply. Clara understood that. She understood it in the specific way of a person who had also spent time wanting something that no amount of capability could provide. "I was in town," she said, "the day my mother died. I was 14. She'd sent me to get medicine from the doctor." She stopped. "By the time I got back." Nathan didn't say anything. He didn't try to give her a word for it, or a consolation, or a comparison. He just let it be what it was. They sat in the quiet for a moment that was longer than it should have been comfortable, and was somehow exactly right. "Your grandfather was the one who knew the land," Nathan said eventually. "Yes, but you're the one who stayed with it." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That's its own kind of knowing," he said. "Maybe a better kind." Clara looked at the valley below them and felt something she didn't entirely trust, which was the specific feeling of being seen by someone who had no obvious reason to look carefully. She had learned to distrust that feeling. She had learned that people who looked carefully at her generally turned out to want something she hadn't offered. But Nathan Holt had not asked her for a single thing she hadn't agreed to first. That didn't mean he wouldn't, but it meant something. Denton Graves came back. He came on the third day of Nathan's visit, and this time he came to the front door and knocked, which was different from his previous approaches, and he came in the early evening when Gerald was home, which was also different. Clara heard his voice from the kitchen and came to the doorway of the parlor. Graves was sitting across from her father with his hat on his knee, and he had brought a man with him, a compact, carefully dressed man named Whitfield, who introduced himself as a representative of a land investment group based in Denver. He had a briefcase and the kind of smile that cost money to maintain. "We understand there are some complications with the banknote," Graves was saying to Gerald. "We're in a position to resolve that immediately. Full payoff of the existing debt, cash in hand, and a buyout offer for the property at—" "The property isn't for sale," Clara said from the doorway. Every head turned. Whitfield looked at her with the polite blankness of a man who had learned not to show his assessments on his face. Graves looked at her with something less polite. "This is a conversation between property owners," Graves said. "I'm named in the partnership agreement as ranch manager," Clara said. "Any transaction involving this property requires my agreement. That's recorded with the Territorial Solicitor's Office." Graves glanced at her father. Gerald Calloway straightened in his chair. "That's correct," he said, and the steadiness in his voice surprised her. Whitfield leaned forward with his professional smile. "Miss Calloway, perhaps I can speak to you directly about—" "The property isn't for sale," she said again. "Mr. Graves knows this because I told him so 2 weeks ago. If a third party has sent a representative, I'd like to know who that third party is and what their interest in this specific property is, because that seems like information we should have been given before this meeting began." Whitfield closed his briefcase. "There's nothing complicated about this," Graves said, and now the pleasant face was gone, and what was underneath it was simpler and less friendly. The banknote is due in 6 weeks. Holt's legal challenge may or may not succeed. If it doesn't, you've got $1,100 and accumulated interest coming due with no clear source of payment. A buyout solves that problem. Mr. Holt will cover the note directly if the challenge fails, Clara said. He told us that explicitly. Did he put that in writing? She had not made him put that in writing. She was aware of the silence that followed the question. Clara, her father said quietly. Did he put it in writing? Graves asked again. Not triumphantly, just with the quiet certainty of a man who already knows the answer. No, Clara said. Then you're trusting a man you've known for less than a month with your family's home, Graves said. Based on his word. The room was very quiet. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at Graves and Whitfield and her father, and she was aware that every set of eyes in the room was waiting to see what she did. She was also aware that she was making a choice that she could not fully justify on paper, and that her grandfather, the practical man who had taught her to read the land and the water and the weather, might have called reckless. Yes, she said. That's what I'm doing. Graves shook his head slowly. Whitfield picked up his briefcase. They left. Gerald Calloway sat in his chair and looked at his daughter. I hope you're right about him, Gerald said. So do I, Papa, Clara said. So do I. She found Nathan in the barn that evening. He was checking June's left foreleg. The mare had been slightly stiff that morning, with the concentrated attention he brought to everything he actually cared about. Which Clara had noticed was his tell the things Nathan Holt paid close attention to were the things that mattered to him. Graves came, she said. He looked up. She told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was his consistent pattern, and one she had come to rely on. I need you to put the note coverage in writing, she said when she finished. If the legal challenge fails. I should have offered that already, he said. He stood up, June shifting under his hands. I'll have my solicitor draw it up tomorrow. Thank you. He looked at her. Graves is going to keep pushing, he said. I know. He has money behind him. That group from Denver, they're not interested in this ranch because it's good land. They're interested because of what's underneath it. Clara went still. What's underneath it? Nathan watched her face carefully. There's a mineral survey from 2 years ago, he said. I commissioned it before I approached your father. Standard practice for a land investment. A pause. There's coal deposit indication along the North Ridge. Small but present. And the spring your grandfather always knew about the hydrological survey suggests there may be a larger underground water source beneath it. The kind that matters in a territory going dry. The kind that would make the land worth 10 times its current value. The kind that would explain why a Denver investment group was sending representatives to a failing Wyoming ranch to make cash offers in the evening. Clara's voice came out very steady. How long have you known this? The survey results came back in May, he said, before my first visit. And you didn't tell me? No, he said. I didn't. The barn was quiet. June stamped once and settled. I'm telling you now, Nathan said, because you deserve to make every decision about this land with the full picture. I should have told you at the beginning. That was wrong and I won't defend it. Clara looked at him. Why didn't you? She asked. I was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't know you yet, he said. I'd commissioned a survey on a distressed property. That's business. And then I came here, and I met the person actually running it, and everything I thought I understood about this situation changed. He held her gaze without flinching. That's not an excuse, it's an explanation. The distinction matters to me even if it doesn't help you right now. She was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about Graves and Whitfield and the Denver Investment Group. She was thinking about the North Ridge and the spring, and her grandfather's voice saying, "This valley remembers water." She was thinking about Nathan's face when he'd said, "I trust the person who knows the ground." And she was thinking about the fact that he was standing in front of her right now, telling her a thing that complicated his position considerably when he could have said nothing. You could have let the challenge play out, she said. Manage the note quietly. I might never have known about the survey. I know, he said. Then why? Because I want you to trust me, he said. Not because you don't have the information to know better. Because you do have it and you choose to anyway. He paused. That's the only kind of trust I'm interested in. Clara Calloway had spent her whole life being the practical one. The one who looked at the ledger instead of the feeling. The one who made the decision that kept the ranch alive instead of the decision that felt right. She looked at Nathan Holt, who had made a mistake and admitted it to her face without being asked in a barn at the end of a hard day, because he had decided that her trust was worth the honesty it cost. I want everything in writing, she said. The note coverage, the mineral survey disclosure, the full picture. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight, she said. Whatever you can write tonight, you write tonight. Something crossed his face. Not surprise. Something closer to respect. All right, he said. Tonight. She left him in the barn and walked back to the house and found her father in the parlor and her sister at the window and the smell of the supper she'd put on earlier, filling the small rooms, and she stood in the middle of it all, the family she was holding together and the land she was fighting for and the future that was still more question than answer. And she felt underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the very legitimate uncertainty, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like the ground was worth standing on. Nathan's solicitor arrived the following morning with the documents Clara had asked for. She read every page at the kitchen table, while the solicitor drank his coffee, and Nathan stood by the window with his arms folded and said nothing, because he understood by now that when Clara Calloway was reading something important, you did not interrupt. She read the note, coverage guarantee first. Then the mineral survey disclosure, 4 pages of technical language that she worked through slowly, because she wanted to understand what she was looking at, not just acknowledge that it existed. Then the amended partnership terms, adjusted as she'd requested to strengthen the family's equity position if direct payment became necessary. She looked up when she finished. There's a clause missing, she said. The solicitor set down his coffee cup. If the mineral deposit is developed at any point during the partnership term, Clara said, the Calloway family retains a 20% share of extraction proceeds. That's not in here. The solicitor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Clara. Add it, he said. The solicitor added it in pen initialed. The change had Clara and Nathan initial it as well, and the document was done. Clara signed it. Nathan signed it. The solicitor tucked everything into his satchel with the same efficient movements as before. And then he was gone, and Clara and Nathan were alone in the kitchen with the morning heat already pressing at the windows and the sound of Boone arriving at the barn to start the day's work on the ridge. The 20%, Nathan said. You thought of that last night. Yes, she said. It's fair, he said. I know it's fair, she said. That's why I asked for it. He almost smiled. She was getting better at reading the almost smiles. They were his version of saying something he wasn't going to say out loud, and she was cataloging them the way she cataloged everything about the land carefully, without drawing attention to what she was doing. I'll be on the ridge by 7, she said, and pushed back from the table. The water line was 4 days from completion. Boone had said 3 days initially, and then the rock layer on the lower section had turned out to run 6 feet deeper than the survey indicated, which added a day and a half of extra excavation work and exhausted everyone involved. Clara had driven the extra pace herself, spending 9 and 10 hours on the ridge, in temperatures that the thermometer in the barn registered at over 100 degrees by afternoon, and by the end of each day, her shirt was soaked through, and her hands shook slightly when she poured water from the canteen. Nathan worked beside her. He didn't comment on the pace, and he didn't suggest she slow down, and he didn't offer to take over the decisions. He asked what needed doing, and he did it. After the 3rd day of this, Boone, who had been with Nathan's operation for 11 years and was not a man who gave compliments easily, said to Clara quietly, while Nathan was on the far end of the section. He don't usually do this, you know, the manual part. What does he usually do? Clara asked. Oversees, plans, pays for things. Boone squinted into the sun. He ain't overseen a single thing this week. He's been working. Clara looked down the ridge to where Nathan was tamping an anchor post into the rocky soil with the same focused, unhurried effort he brought to everything. I noticed, she said. Boone made a sound that might have been approval and went back to his section. Clara went back to hers. She noticed. She didn't say anything more about it. But she noticed, and the noticing was accumulating into something she was going to have to reckon with at some point, and she was choosing to push that reckoning to a later date, because there was too much else to manage right now. The wire from Nathan's attorney in Cheyenne came on the 5th day of August. Clara was at the barn when Nathan came out of the house with the paper in his hand, and his face arranged into the particular careful stillness that she had learned meant either very good news or very bad news, and the specific quality of the stillness told her it wasn't the good kind. "Tell me," she said. "The challenge was denied," he said. "Judge Arlen in Cheyenne. He ruled the bank's procedural objection was technically valid." He paused. "The note is due in full, 5 weeks." Clara absorbed that for a moment. "Can you appeal?" "Yes, and we will. But an appeal won't resolve before October 1st. "So you pay the note directly?" "Yes. And then we appeal to recover the restructuring terms." "That's the plan." She looked at him. "Arlen," she said. "Is he connected to Graves?" Nathan was quiet for just a beat too long. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It's not." Clara turned and walked back into the barn and stood with her hands on the nearest stall post and breathed slowly for a count of 10. The note payment would come from Nathan's resources, which meant the amended partnership terms became more significant, which meant he had more leverage than when they started, which was the opposite of what she had spent 2 months working toward. She turned back around. I was standing in the barn doorway, waiting, and he did not look like a man recalculating his leverage. He looked like a man who had just delivered bad news and was waiting to find out if he was still trusted. "I want a second attorney involved in the appeal," she said. "Not yours, someone I find independently." "That's reasonable," he said immediately. "And I want access to all correspondence between your office and the bank, everything that's been exchanged since the original note was filed." "You'll have it by tomorrow," he said. She held his gaze. "Nathan." "Yes." "If I find anything in those documents that changes the picture." "Then you change the picture accordingly," he said. "That's how it should work." She nodded once. She went back to work. The documents arrived the following day, and she spent the evening going through them at the kitchen table with her father reading over her shoulder, and Violet pretending not to listen from the other room. There was nothing that changed the picture. The correspondence was exactly what Nathan had described, a straightforward restructuring attempt that had been blocked by a procedural challenge from the bank's local representative, a man named Ferris, who had filed his objection on the same day that Whitfield from the Denver group had arrived in Harrow Flats. The same day. She put her finger on that date and looked at it. "Papa," she said. Gerald leaned in. "Graves, Ferris, and Whitfield," she said. "They're coordinated. Look at the dates." Her father looked. His jaw tightened. "Can we prove it?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But we don't need to prove it to the appeal court. We need to prove the procedural objection was bad faith, and bad faith has a lower evidentiary standard than fraud." She sat back. "I need to talk to a lawyer." She found one in Casper, a woman named Margaret Fitch, who had practiced territorial law for 12 years and who came highly recommended by the circuit judge's office, which meant she was recommended by someone with no connection to Harrow Flats. Clara wrote to her that night and sent the letter the following morning. Then she went back to the water line, because the water line was 4 days from done, and nothing that was happening in Cheyenne changed the fact that the South pasture needed water by September. The line was finished on a Tuesday. Boone opened the head gate at the spring on the North Ridge at 7 in the morning, and they all stood, Clara, Nathan, Boone, and Gerald, who had ridden up the ridge for the first time in 2 years, because Clara had asked him, and he'd said yes, and they watched the water come down. It came slowly at first, finding its way through the new pipe, and then it came steadily, and then Boone rode ahead to the south pasture trough and called back that it was filling, and Gerald Calloway made a sound that Clara had not heard from him in a long time, a simple, unguarded sound of relief. She didn't look at Nathan right away. She looked at the water running through the pipe they'd built, and she thought of her grandfather and what he'd said about land that remembers water. and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Then she looked at Nathan. He was looking at her. Not at the waterline, not at her father's reaction, not at the valley spread below them in the morning light. At her. She looked away first, because there was a limit to what she could hold at one time. "Good work," she said to Boone. "It was her route," Boone said, jerking his chin at Clara, with the complete simplicity of a man stating a fact. "I just dug where she told me." Denton Graves made his third move on a Saturday. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He came to church. Harrow Flats had a single church, a white-painted building on the main street that served the entire valley, and the congregation knew everyone's business, the way small congregations do not, maliciously, mostly, but inevitably. Clara attended every Sunday because her grandfather had built one of the pews with his own hands, and she considered it a form of continuity. She was standing outside after the service talking with Mrs. Aldridge Boone's wife, a direct woman who kept chickens and had strong opinions about rain, when she became aware that Denton Graves was speaking to a group of men near the fence, and that the group included 3 ranchers who held neighboring properties and who were watching her with expressions she didn't like. She excused herself from Mrs. Aldridge and moved toward the group. She was close enough to hear Graves say, "Can't know what Holt's intentions actually are, and the legal situation," before he noticed her and stopped. The men looked at her. "I don't mean to interrupt," she said pleasantly, "but since my name has come up—" "Miss Calloway," one of the ranchers said. His name was Walt Purcell, and he ran a cattle operation south of the creek. He was not a bad man, just a cautious one. "We were just discussing the legal situation with the bank. The bank challenge was denied," she said. "We're filing an appeal in Cheyenne next week. Mr. Holt is covering the note payment directly in the interim. The land is secure." "Holt covering the note," Graves said, "with his own money, which means he holds the debt now instead of the bank." "He holds the partnership agreement," Clara said, "which I signed, which is recorded, which includes terms protecting the Calloway family's equity position. On a man's word," Graves said. He said it to the group, not to her. On the word of a man who came down from the mountains with a surveyor's report he didn't share until he shared it, Clara said. Her voice was steady. It took work. He disclosed the survey results, corrected the oversight, and amended the partnership terms accordingly. That's all in writing and available for review. She looked at the group of men, at Walt Purcell's careful face, at the 2 others she knew less well. "Mr. Graves has a financial interest in seeing this land sold to a Denver investment group. That's not a secret. I'd ask you to consider that interest when you weigh what he tells you about my family's situation." Graves went very still. "That's a serious thing to say in public," he said quietly. "The connection between your recommendation and the Denver group is documented by date," she said. "If you'd like to dispute the timeline, I'll welcome the conversation." She held his gaze for a moment that was long enough to mean something, and then she nodded to Walt Purcell and the others and walked away. Her hands were not entirely steady. She put them in her pockets. Nathan was waiting at the edge of the churchyard, having watched from a distance. "You didn't need me there," he said as she reached him. "I never needed you there," she said. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" "The point is that they'll listen differently if they see us standing together," she said. "In this town, in this context." She paused. "It shouldn't matter, but it does." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know." "I don't like it," she said. "I know that too." She walked toward June, who was hitched at the post near the road. Nathan walked beside her. "You handled Graves well," he said. "He's not done," she said. "He has money and patience, and he's used to getting what he wants. One public correction doesn't change that." "No," Nathan agreed. "It doesn't." She untied June and stood with the reins in her hand and looked at Nathan Holt, who was looking back at her in the particular way he had, steady, unhurried, like a man who has time to see what's actually in front of him. "There's something else coming," she said. "I can feel it. The way you can feel a change in the weather before the clouds show." "I believe you," he said simply. "That's not reassuring," she said. That's just agreeing with the problem. No, he said. It's agreeing that you're right, which means we prepare instead of wait. The thing that was coming arrived on a Thursday morning 12 days later. Clara woke at 5 to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed before she was fully awake because 4 years of managing a dry summer ranch had trained her body to respond to that smell the way other people responded to alarm bells. She pulled on her boots and went to the window and saw what she'd hoped not to see, a smear of orange light above the ridgeline to the north. The North Ridge, where the spring was. Where 2 months of work and every hope for the south pasture had been built into a water line that ran through grass and scrub that hadn't had real rain in 2 months. Fire, she said to no one, and then she was moving. She had the barn door open, and June saddled in under 4 minutes, which was fast even for her. Boone had given her a hand signal system before he'd finished the job. 3 flags at the ridge post for fire danger, 2 for water problems, and she grabbed the emergency kit she kept hanging by the barn door and was on June's back before she'd fully formed a plan. Nathan came out of the house behind her, already pulling his coat on. He'd been sleeping in the guest room for the past week, staying close as the legal proceedings developed. North Ridge, he said. North Ridge, she confirmed. He didn't ask to take the lead. He got his horse from the corral and followed. The fire was running along the east face of the ridge, feeding on the dry grass that stood between the upper section of the water line and the tree line. It was not catastrophic yet. Clara could see that from the road, the way the smoke was rising straight up in a column, which meant the wind was low, which was the only piece of luck in an otherwise very bad morning. Low wind meant it was moving slowly. Slowly meant there was time. She pulled June up hard and turned to Nathan. "We need to cut a break along the lower section of the line," she said. "If we can get the grass cleared between the fire and the pipe anchors before the wind picks up." "The wind's going to pick up," he said. He was looking at the smoke column. "I know. That's why we have maybe an hour." She was already calculating. "I know where the shovels are at the ridge camp. Boone left equipment. If I ride ahead and start the brake line..." "I'll ride for the ranch hands," he said. "Purcell's operation is half a mile south. He'll have men." "Go," she said. He went. She pushed June up the ridge trail as fast as she dared on the uneven ground, and the smoke got thicker as she climbed, and the orange light on the east face grew more specific and more real, and she heard the fire before she saw it, a low, uneven crackling that was the sound of dry things finding their end. She got to the ridge camp, tied June to the equipment post, grabbed 2 shovels and a pickaxe, and started on the brake line. The principle was simple. Fire needs fuel. Cut the fuel away from what you want to protect, and the fire has nowhere to go. She'd learned this from her grandfather at 12 years old, watching him clear a break around the barn during a dry October moving with deliberate speed and no panic. No panic. The most important tool. She swung the shovel and turned earth and cleared grass, working the line 20 feet downslope from the upper pipe anchor, moving east along the ridge, and the smoke was in her lungs, and her eyes were watering, and she kept moving. She heard the riders before she saw them. Nathan came back in 18 minutes with Walt Purcell and 4 of his hands, and 2 men she didn't know who must have been passing on the road and seen the smoke and come, because that was what people did when there was a fire on someone else's land. Walt Purcell looked at the brake line she'd started and the direction she was working and said, "Take the west side, she's got the east." And his men fanned out without another word. Nathan was beside her with a shovel in 90 seconds. "You rode fast," she said, not stopping her work. "Purcell was already saddling up when I got there," he said. "He saw the smoke." "Good man," she said. "He said the same about you," Nathan said. "Just now." She kept working and didn't say anything, and was absurdly, unexpectedly moved by that which she pushed down, because there was a fire coming, and this was not the moment. For 40 minutes, it was everything. The wind held. The brake line extended. Nathan worked beside her, matching her pace without being asked to, reading her direction instinctively. When she moved east, he moved to cover the gap she left when she flagged him toward the rockier section. He couldn't see from his angle, he went without question. She'd never had a partner in physical work who moved that intuitively with her. It was disorienting to notice. She noticed anyway. At the 40-minute mark, the wind shifted. She felt it before the fire showed it a change in the air pressure, a slight turn in the direction of the smoke, and she straightened up and shouted, "Brake, move west, the wind's turning." Everyone stopped and looked. The smoke column began to lean. Walt Purcell's voice carried across the ridge. "She's right west flank now." The whole group repositioned. Clara moved with them, reading the fire's new angle, calculating where the brake line needed to extend to cut off the new direction of travel. She could feel the math of it, the distance, the wind speed, the rate of burn working through her, the way the waterline grade had worked through her, the way everything about this land worked through her, because she had been paying attention for a very long time. "There," she said to Nathan, pointing 20 feet north of their current position. "If we can get that section cleared before the wind fully establishes." He was already moving. They got it cleared. By 11 in the morning, the fire was contained, not dead, but contained backed against the rock face on the east side of the ridge, where there was no fuel left for it to consume. The smoke was thinning. The upper pipe anchors were untouched. The water line was intact. Clara sat down on a rock at the edge of the brake line and let herself stop for the first time in 3 hours. Every muscle in her body weighed twice what it usually did. Her throat was raw from smoke and her eyes were burning, and she had a 6-inch scrape along her left forearm from a shovel handle that had slipped in her grip somewhere in the second hour that she hadn't noticed until now. Nathan came and sat on a rock 3 feet away. He was in the same condition, smoke-stained, rough-breathed, thoroughly finished. Walt Purcell walked over and looked at the two of them, and looked at the contained fire, and looked at the intact water line, and he said, "Miss Calloway." She looked up. "I've been in this valley for 14 years, Purcell said. "I've seen 3 ridge fires." He paused. "You saved that line." "We saved it," she said. "All of us." "You read the wind," he said. 20 seconds earlier than any of us, and we'd have lost the west anchor." He nodded once, the decisive nod of a man settling something in his own mind. "That's your land up there, Miss Calloway, and you know it better than anybody in this county." He walked back to his men. Clara looked at the ground between her boots for a moment. Nathan said nothing. He didn't need to. They rode down from the ridge in the early afternoon, the group of them spread out on the trail with the smoke still rising thinly behind them, and Clara was quiet for most of the descent, which Nathan let her be. At the bottom, Purcell and his men peeled off toward the south road, and the 2 strangers who'd come off the road nodded and rode on, and it was just Clara and Nathan on the last stretch back to the ranch. "You knew exactly what to do," Nathan said. "My grandfather drilled brake line protocol into me when I was a child," she said. "He lost a barn to a ridge fire in '61. He didn't lose another." "It wasn't just protocol," Nathan said. "You felt the wind change before anyone else." "You notice things when you pay attention long enough," she said. "Clara." She looked at him. "It wasn't the wind," he said quietly. "Or it wasn't only the wind. It was everything. The way you managed those men, Purcell's hands men who didn't know you, they followed your direction without hesitation. Because you were right, and they could tell you were right." He paused. "That's not something you learn from protocol." She held his gaze for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to dismiss what Purcell said the minute you're alone," he said. "You're going to file it away as nothing more than what needed to be done. And I want you to hear it before you do that." He held her gaze. "What happened up there today mattered. You mattered." Clara turned forward and looked at the road. "The water line is intact," she said. "Yes." "That's what matters practically." "Yes," he said. "And what I'm telling you matters in a different way. Both things are true." She didn't answer, but she didn't dismiss it either, which was itself something new. They were back at the barn when she found out how the fire started. Boone had come out from town when he heard, and he'd ridden up the east approach to the ridge while they were coming down the west, and he arrived at the ranch 20 minutes after they did, with dirt on his knees and a piece of metal in his hand. "Found this at the origin point," he said. He held it out to Clara. She took it. It was a section of lantern glass cracked and blackened with a curved metal base, the kind that belonged to a specific type of trail lantern, not a ranch lantern, not the kind you used on a ridge, the kind you carried when you were traveling through at night and didn't want to be seen. Clara turned it over in her hand. "That fire didn't start itself," Boone said. He said it flatly without drama, because that was how Boone said everything. Nathan was very still beside her. She looked at the lantern piece and thought about Denton Graves and Whitfield from Denver, and the carefully coordinated dates in the bank correspondence. And she thought about what a ridge fire would do to a water line that had taken 2 months to build. And she thought about what the land would look like to a Denver investment group if the Calloway operation lost its water solution 2 months before the banknote came due. It would look like a distressed property with no viable future. It would look like something you could buy cheaply. "Boone," she said, "did you see anyone on the East Road last night?" Boone thought for a moment. "Didn't come in on the East Road, but when I rode it this morning there were tracks. 2 horses. The rain day before would have set them fresh, meaning they were made overnight." "2 horses," Nathan said quietly. Clara handed the lantern piece to Nathan. She looked at Boone. "Can you ride back up and mark where you found this exact location, and trace those tracks as far as they go? Don't disturb anything." "Yes, ma'am," Boone said and went. She turned to Nathan. His face had gone to something hard and settled that she hadn't seen from him before. He was a controlled man in most circumstances, calm in the way of someone who'd learned that control was more effective than heat. But holding the lantern piece, he looked the way still water looks right before it moves. "This changes things," he said. "This confirms things," she said. "There's a difference." She took the lantern piece back from him. "I need you to contact your attorney tonight, not the appeal filing a separate action. I want every piece of correspondence, every recorded transaction, every meeting between Graves and Whitfield and the bank's local representative. I want the whole picture assembled." She paused. "And I want to know who Arlen is connected to." "The judge in Cheyenne. The judge who denied the challenge on the same timeline as everything else," she said. Nathan looked at her. "If you're right about Arlen, I'm right about the pattern," she said. "I don't know how far up it goes yet, but I know what a coordinated campaign looks like when I'm in the middle of one." She looked him directly in the eye. "And I know that whoever set that fire last night did it because we built the water line. Because we found a solution they didn't expect us to find. Which means we're further ahead than they thought we'd be." He held her gaze. "You don't seem frightened," he said. "I'm terrified," she said quietly. "But being terrified and being clear about what needs to happen next are not mutually exclusive." He looked at her for a long moment, the way he'd looked at her from the parlor doorway on the first day when she was standing in the gray dress with her chin up, except that now he wasn't looking at a woman he'd just met. He was looking at someone he'd spent 2 months working beside in the heat and the difficulty of real things. "All right," he said. "I'll contact the attorney tonight." "Tonight," she said. "Clara." She paused. "I need you to know something," he said. "What happened on that ridge today? The wind, the brake line, the way Purcell's men followed your call, that isn't going to go away. This town saw what you did. Whatever Graves has been building up in people's minds about the Calloway situation about you." He stopped. "Today changed it. I watched their faces." She looked at him. "People follow competence," he said. "When things actually matter. When there's a real fire on the ridge, they follow the person who knows what to do. And this town now knows who that person is." She stood very still for a moment. "That won't stop Graves," she said. "No," he said. "But it changes what he's working against." She nodded once. She walked into the barn and stood alone for a moment in the quiet, with the smell of smoke still in her hair, and the weight of everything that had happened in the last 12 hours pressing down on her shoulders. Her grandfather had said the land tests the people who love it, not to break them, to find out what they're made of. She looked at her burned hands and her smoke-stained work clothes and thought about the water line still running clean and cold, down the ridge to the south pasture trough intact through everything, and thought about Walt Purcell's voice saying, "That's your land up there." She thought about Nathan Holt's face when he'd said you mattered, and she thought about a lantern piece in her hand that told her this was not over that the people trying to take what her grandfather had built were willing to do more than file legal papers and send representatives with briefcases. She was frightened. She was also underneath the fear something she hadn't felt in a long time. She was ready. Margaret Fitch arrived from Casper on a Wednesday morning 3 days after the fire. She was 51 years old, narrow through the shoulders, with gray-streaked hair pinned severely, and eyes that moved through a room the way a hawk moves over a field, not frantically just covering everything. She wore a traveling suit that had seen considerable use and carried a leather satchel that looked heavier than it probably was, and she shook Clara's hand at the door with the firm directness of a woman who had learned early that soft handshakes cost you credibility before you'd said a word. "You wrote a clear letter," Margaret said by way of greeting. "I appreciate that." "I've read enough unclear ones to know the difference," Clara said. They understood each other immediately. They sat at the kitchen table, Clara, Margaret, Nathan, and Gerald, who insisted on being present, and who sat with his hands folded and his mouth mostly shut, which was the most useful contribution he could make, and Clara laid out everything. The original note, the partnership agreement, the bank's procedural objection, the denied challenge, the coordinated dates, the lantern piece, Boone's account of the tracks on the East Road. Margaret listened without interrupting. She made notes in a small leather-bound book with a stub pencil, and when Clara finished, she sat back and looked at the table for a moment with the expression of someone assembling a structure in her mind. "The lantern piece," Margaret said. "Where is it now?" "I have it," Clara said. "Good. Don't clean it. Don't handle it more than necessary." Margaret made another note. "The tracks Boone observed, did he document the location as you asked?" "He marked the spot and sketched the track pattern. I have his notes." "Even better." Margaret looked up. "Miss Calloway, what you've described is not a property dispute. It's a coordinated scheme to force a distressed sale through manufactured legal obstruction, and if I'm reading this correctly, deliberate property destruction. That's fraud. Potentially arson. Both carry federal implications in a territory." The word arson sat on the table like something heavy. Gerald made a sound. "We can't prove arson yet," Clara said carefully. "No," Margaret agreed. "But we can establish the pattern well enough to warrant federal attention. And federal attention, in my experience, has a remarkable effect on the behavior of people who've been operating under the assumption that territorial courts are the only thing they have to worry about." She looked at Nathan. "Mr. Holt, your attorney in Cheyenne, do you trust him?" "Professionally, yes," Nathan said. "Personally, I'm less certain." "Then he doesn't see these documents until I've reviewed what he already has." Margaret closed her notebook. "I want 3 days. I want everything you have. The bank correspondence, the survey documents, the partnership agreement, Boone's notes, and that lantern piece, and I want 3 days to build what I need to take to the federal land office." 3 days, Clara said. "Possibly 2, Margaret said. "I don't believe in wasting time when the timeline is this tight." She was right about 2 days. On the first day, Margaret sat at the kitchen table from 6 in the morning until 11 at night and read every document Clara owned relating to the Calloway property going back 8 years. She asked questions in precise bursts, a question, a pause for the answer, a note, another question, and the questions were never the ones Clara expected, which meant Margaret was seeing angles Clara hadn't fully developed yet. At 2 in the afternoon, she looked up from the bank correspondence and said, "Who is Ferris?" "The bank's local representative." "He sits on the Provisional Council with Graves," Clara said. "Before that." "I don't know his history." Find out," Margaret said. By tomorrow morning, Clara found out. She asked Mrs. Aldridge, who knew everything, and Mrs. Aldridge said that Ferris had come to Harrow Flats 7 years ago from Denver, that he'd worked for a land investment firm before moving into banking, that the firm he'd worked for was called Western Consolidated Holdings. Western Consolidated Holdings. Clara brought that name to Margaret the following morning. Margaret was already awake, already at the table, already writing. When Clara said the name, she stopped writing. "Western Consolidated Holdings," Margaret repeated. "Yes." "Whitfield," Margaret said. "The man Graves brought to your father. Do you know what firm he represented? Clara went cold. I assumed Denver. Get me the card he left, if he left one. Violet, it turned out, had kept the card. She'd tucked it into the frame of the parlor mirror because she thought the embossed lettering was pretty, which was the kind of thing Violet did that Clara usually found exasperating and which she was now profoundly grateful for. The card read, James R. Whitfield Acquisitions Representative, Western Consolidated Holdings, Denver, Colorado. Clara brought it to Margaret and set it on the table without saying anything. Margaret picked it up, looked at it and said, There it is. Ferris worked for them before the bank, Clara said. He's their man inside the territorial banking structure, which means the procedural objection wasn't administrative error, Margaret said. It was executed from inside the bank by someone placed there specifically to create legal obstruction on properties Western Consolidated wanted to acquire. She set the card down. This isn't just fraud, Miss Calloway. This is organized acquisition fraud operating across multiple territories. Your property is one of several. The room was very quiet. Several, Clara said. I've seen this pattern before, Margaret said. Different players, same structure. Find distressed properties with underlying value. Place an operative in the territorial banking system. Obstruct debt restructuring. Apply pressure through legal and extra-legal means. She paused, and the pause meant something. The fire on your ridge was not there first. Clara sat down. She sat down because her legs made the decision before her mind did, and she put both hands flat on the table and breathed and looked at Margaret Fitch, who was looking back at her with the steady, unsentimental expression of a woman who had delivered this kind of news before and knew the only useful response to it was clarity. How many properties? Clara asked. Across Wyoming and Montana territory, based on the pattern, my estimate is 7 or 8 that are active. Possibly more that have already resolved. Margaret picked up her pencil. Which is why this goes to the federal land office, not the territorial court. The territorial judge in Cheyenne is potentially compromised. We go above him. Arlen, Clara said. I want to know who appointed Arlen, Margaret said. And who he's had dinner with in the last 2 years. Can your ranch hand find that out? Boone finds things when I ask him to, Clara said. Then ask him. Nathan had been listening from the doorway. Clara didn't know how long he'd been standing there. She looked up and found him, and his face had the same settled hardness it had carried since she'd put the lantern piece in his hand. Not anger exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has recalculated what kind of fight he's in. 7 or 8 properties, he said. At minimum, Margaret said. She looked at him without particular deference. Mr. Holt, how much do you know about the other distressed properties in this territory? Some, he said. He came fully into the kitchen and sat down. I've been approached about several over the past 2 years. Opportunities to acquire. I passed on most of them. Why? The terms felt wrong, he said. The sellers were under pressure in ways that didn't add up to simple drought or debt. I don't buy land from people who are being squeezed. Margaret looked at him for a moment. Do you remember which properties? He named 3. Margaret wrote them down and compared them against her notes and said quietly, All 3 are on my list. The kitchen was silent for a beat. They approached you, Clara said to Nathan. Yes, knowing your resources. Knowing you could move quickly on a distressed purchase. She turned it over. They wanted you to be the buyer, a legitimate established rancher acquiring properties in the normal way. It would have looked clean. And when I didn't buy, Nathan said slowly, they found another vehicle, the investment group. He looked at Clara. Which means they've been watching this territory for at least 2 years, and they know who I am and how I operate. They know you came here, Clara said. Yes. And they know about the partnership. Yes. Which means they know that if the Calloway land holds it, becomes a case study that threatens the rest of their acquisitions. Other property owners in distress watching. What happens here if we succeed? If we prove that coordinated legal obstruction can be beaten, it makes their entire operation harder. Margaret set her pencil down and looked at Clara with something that was as close to admiration as her expression seemed to permit. That's exactly right, she said. So they're not just trying to get this land, Clara said. They need this land as a precedent. Yes, Margaret said. Clara stood up. Then we need to get to the federal land office before they realize how close we are to the full picture. The decision was made that night. Margaret would ride for Cheyenne the following morning with copies of every relevant document and the lantern piece wrapped in oilcloth in her satchel. She would file simultaneously with the Federal Land Commissioner's office and the Territorial Marshal's office, two separate filings to ensure that a compromise in one channel didn't kill the action in the other. Nathan would ride with her as far as Laramie, where his attorney's office could provide additional documentation from the appeal filing. The two legal actions would be coordinated to arrive at the federal office within hours of each other. Clara would stay. That was her decision. Nathan didn't argue with it, but he didn't like it, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table after Margaret had gone to the guest room and said so directly. If Graves realizes what's happening, he started. Then he realizes it when Margaret is already in Cheyenne, Clara said. Which is why it matters that I'm here looking like nothing has changed. If we both leave, it signals something. If I'm on the property doing exactly what I've been doing, it buys time. It also puts you here alone with whatever Graves decides to do next. I'm not alone, she said. Boone is here. Purcell's operation is half a mile south, and my father is here. She paused. Papa may surprise you. He already has, Nathan said quietly. When did you decide he had more in him than you'd given him credit for? Clara thought about it. The day he told Graves and Whitfield that the property required my agreement, he didn't hesitate. No, Nathan said. He didn't. They were quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table was burning low, and outside the night insects were making their steady summer noise, and the house felt very full of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Nathan, she said. Yes. If something goes wrong in Cheyenne, nothing is going to go wrong in Cheyenne. If it does, she said, and held his gaze until he stopped interrupting. If it does, I want you to know that what you've done here, not the money, not the legal action, but the way you've done it. Telling me about the survey. Putting my name in the documents. Working the ridge with Boone like a man who doesn't have 3 territories to his name. She paused. It mattered. I want you to know that. Nathan looked at her across the table in the low lamplight. Clara, he said. And then he stopped, and she could see him choosing between the careful thing and the true thing. He chose the true thing. I came to this valley to make a business decision, he said. I made it inside of 3 days. Everything since then has been... He stopped again. Found the word. Personal. In a way I didn't plan for, and am not entirely sure how to manage. She held very still. I'm not saying that to complicate things, he said. I know the timing is wrong. I know there's a great deal unresolved. I'm saying it because I told you I would always choose honesty over convenience, and it would be dishonest to sit across from you and pretend that what I feel when I watch you work is purely professional respect. The lamp flickered. How long? She asked. Her voice came out steady, which was an achievement. Since the North Ridge, he said. The first morning. You showed me the spring, and you talked about your grandfather, and you said the land remembers water. He looked at the table for a moment. I've met a great many capable people in my life. I have not met many people who love something the way you love this land. It was something I hadn't expected to find. Clara looked at her hands on the table. The burn marks from the ridge fire were still visible red lines across her palms that would fade in a week or two. I am not simple to know, she said. I'm aware of that, he said. I'm not asking for simple. I make decisions independently, she said. I always have. That won't change because of... I wouldn't want it to, he said. Clara, I have been watching you make decisions independently for 2 months. That is specifically not the thing I would want to change. She looked at him. All right, she said. All right, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Clara pushed back from the table and picked up the lamp and said, You should sleep. You're riding at first light. Yes, he said. She was at the hallway when he said her name once more. She turned. When I get back from Cheyenne, he said. I'd like to have a different conversation, not about land or legal proceedings." "I know," she said. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark for a long time and did not sleep for at least an hour, which was unusual for a woman who fell asleep the moment her head was down. She thought that was probably information. Nathan and Margaret left before dawn. Clara was up to see them off, standing in the yard in the early dark with a lantern, and Nathan paused beside his horse and looked at her for a moment that was exactly long enough and not 1 second more. "Don't do anything I'd argue with," he said. "I'll do whatever the situation requires," she said. "Same as always." He almost smiled. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm afraid of." He rode. She went back to work. The days without him were strange in a way she hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have admitted if asked. The ranch was the same. The work was the same. Boone was there every morning, steady and efficient. Her father did more than she expected. He rode the fence line on the second day without being asked, came back with a report on 3 posts that needed resetting, and fixed them himself by afternoon. Violet made dinner 3 nights running without being reminded, and didn't mention Whitfield's embossed card once. Clara moved through all of it and did what needed doing, and she was aware that the house had a different quality in the evenings without Nathan in the guest room. Not empty exactly, but quieter in a specific way. The way a piece of music is different when one instrument is gone. She didn't tell anyone that. On the 3rd day, Graves came. He came in the afternoon, and this time he came without Whitfield and without the pleasant face, and he rode directly to the front of the house and dismounted and came to the door and knocked like a man who has moved past pretense. Gerald opened the door. Clara appeared behind him in the hallway. Graves looked at Gerald and then at Clara and said, "Where's Holt?" "Traveling," Gerald said. "Cheyenne," Graves said. It wasn't a question. His jaw was tight. "You filed something." "I don't know what you're referring to," Gerald said. And he said it well, neither confirming nor denying, just a man expressing mild confusion. Graves looked at Clara. "Miss Calloway, this is your last opportunity to take a reasonable offer. If what I think is being filed in Cheyenne is filed, the timeline accelerates and the outcome becomes significantly worse for everyone involved." "Worse for whom?" Clara asked. "For you," he said. "For your family. A legal action of this kind against established banking interests doesn't succeed quietly. It creates—" He paused. "Difficulties." Clara looked at Denton Graves, a man she had known her whole life, who had sat in this valley for 20 years and built his position on being the person who managed transitions, who helped properties change hands, who smoothed the path between distressed sellers and organized buyers. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had made incremental choices over years, each one small enough to justify until the whole of what he'd built was something he couldn't acknowledge in daylight. She felt something close to pity and made sure it didn't show. "Mr. Graves," she said, "the property isn't for sale. The legal action is proceeding, and I think you should speak with your own attorney before you say anything else to me." His face went through something. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Western Consolidated Holdings has been operating this scheme across 7 or 8 properties in Wyoming and Montana Territory," she said. "They placed operatives in territorial banking structures to obstruct debt restructuring on properties with underlying mineral or water value. They've used arson at least once, and I believe more than once, as a pressure tactic. The Federal Land Commissioner's Office is currently reviewing documentation that establishes the full pattern." She held his gaze. "I understand exactly what I'm dealing with, Mr. Graves. The question is whether you understand what you're dealing with." The color left his face. "You have a choice," Clara said quietly now. "You can be the man who cooperated with the federal investigation when the opportunity arose, or you can be something else." She let that sit for a moment. "I think you know which one ends better." Graves stood on the porch for a long moment. Then he put his hat on and walked to his horse and rode away without another word. Gerald closed the door. He stood in the hallway and looked at his daughter. "Clara," he said, "when did you—" He stopped, started over. "Who taught you to do that?" "Grandfather," she said. "He always said the person in the right has nothing to gain from raising their voice." Gerald was quiet. Then he said, "Your mother would have said the same thing." Clara looked at her father and saw in the tired lines of his face something she hadn't seen for a long time. Not the gray exhaustion she'd been watching accumulate for 2 years, but something older and quieter, a man remembering who he came from. "I know, Papa," she said. The wire from Margaret came on a Saturday 4 days after she'd left. Clara read it in the telegraph office with the operator maintaining his professional discretion. Filing accepted. Stop. Federal Commissioner opening investigation. Stop. Marshal Office issuing summons for Ferris and Whitfield. Stop Arlen under review. Stop Holt returning Monday. Stop well done. Stop Fitch. Clara folded the paper. She sat in the chair beside the telegraph operator's desk for a moment, which she didn't usually do, and the operator looked at his hands and gave her the moment because he was a decent man. She thought about a gray dress with a mended hem and a parlor she'd walked into, expecting nothing, and a man who had looked at her when no one else did. She thought about her grandfather's voice. The land tests the people who love it. Not to break them, to find out what they're made of. She stood up and walked out into the summer afternoon and mounted June and rode home. Boone was at the fence when she got back, resetting one of the posts her father had identified. He looked up. "Good news," he said. He was that specific kind of perceptive. "Good enough," she said. "Holt coming back. Monday." Boone nodded and went back to the post. "He's a decent man," he said to the fence. "For a man with as much money as he's got." "He is," Clara said. "You know it ain't common," Boone said. "A man in his position working the ridge the way he did. Working beside a woman the way he did. Without making it something." Clara sat on June and looked at the ranch her grandfather had built and her father had held onto by his fingernails, and that she had kept alive through 4 years and 1 very hard summer. "I know," she said. "I know it isn't common." She dismounted and led June to the barn and started the evening work, which was the same as it had always been, except that the land felt different now, not lighter exactly, but clearer. The way the air goes after a storm has finally broken. Graves sent a letter on Sunday. It came to the house by courier, a boy from town, who handed it to Gerald at the door and rode off fast. Gerald brought it to Clara in the kitchen. She opened it and read it. Graves had retained an attorney. He was requesting a meeting with Margaret Fitch to discuss cooperation with the federal investigation. He was distancing himself from Whitfield and Western Consolidated Holdings. He said in the careful language of a man who had finally understood his position that he had been unaware of the full scope of the scheme and wished to provide whatever documentation he held that might assist the investigation. Clara read it twice. She set it on the table. Her father said, "Is that?" "He's turning," she said. "Which means he knows the investigation has enough to proceed without him, and he's trying to get ahead of it." She paused. "It also means he had documents he's been holding that will help Margaret's case." "So it's good news," Gerald said. "It's very good news," she said. "Forward that to Margaret." She went back to what she'd been doing. She thought about Graves on the porch the day before the color leaving his face when she'd named the scheme, and she thought about the long chain of small choices that had brought him to this letter this Sunday morning, this moment of trying to recover something from what he'd built. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something more like tired grief, the recognition of what greed does to ordinary people over ordinary time. She was not going to waste the lesson. Monday came the way summer mornings did, fast and bright and already hot by 7. Clara was at the spring on the North Ridge, checking the head gate and the upper pipe connections. The way she did every few days when she heard the horse on the trail below. She didn't have to look to know who it was. She heard Nathan dismount. She heard his boots on the ridge trail. She didn't turn around until he was close enough that turning around was the natural thing to do. He looked like a man who had ridden hard for 3 days and was not going to mention it. His coat was dusty, and his jaw had a week of beard, and his eyes had the particular quality of someone who has been thinking hard for a sustained period. "The head gate is holding," she said. "I can see that," he said. "Margaret's filing was accepted. I know, she wired me. Graves is cooperating. I know that too." He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her the way he always looked at her, like he had time for it, like there was nothing more pressing than the actual seeing of her. "How are you?" The question was so simple, it almost undid her, which was the specific effect of simple things delivered with complete sincerity. "I'm fine," she said. "The land is intact. The investigation is moving. The bank can't touch the note while federal proceedings are active." "Clara, I'm fine," she said again, and then because he was still looking at her in that way, "I'm tired. It's been a hard few days." "Yes," he said. "I imagine it has." He came and stood beside her at the head gate, and they looked at the water moving through the pipe they'd built together, running clean and cold down the ridge toward the south pasture where it was needed. "The federal commissioner wants testimony from the ranch manager of the Calloway property," he said. "Margaret says your account of the lantern piece and the coordinated dates is central to the pattern evidence." "I know," she said. "I'll go to Cheyenne." "I'll go with you." She looked at him. "You don't need to. I want to," he said. "There's a difference." He held her gaze. "I told you in the kitchen that I wanted a different conversation when I got back. I still want that. But I wanted to check on the land first. And on you." Clara Calloway stood on the ridge her grandfather had walked and looked at the man beside her and thought about everything the last 2 months had asked of her and what she had found out she was made of. "The land's all right," she said. "I know," he said. "And you?" She was quiet for a moment. The water moved through the pipe. The summer pressed down on everything with the particular weight of a season almost at its end. "Ask me again in Cheyenne," she said. He almost smiled, and this time it was close enough to the real thing that she counted it. "All right," he said. "I will." They stood together on the ridge for a moment that was longer than necessary and exactly right, with the valley spread below them and the evidence of everything they'd built and fought for, running clean and steady through the pipe between them and the hardest part behind them, and something else unnamed, unhurried, real, just beginning to find its shape. They rode to Cheyenne on a Wednesday. Clara had made the journey twice before in her life, once at 16 with her grandfather, once at 20 when the banknote was first filed, and her father had needed someone to read the fine print. Both times she had gone as someone attached to someone else's purpose. This time she went as herself, with her name on a federal summons and 3 months of documented evidence in a satchel across her lap. Nathan rode beside her. They didn't talk much on the road, which was comfortable in the specific way that silence between two people becomes when they've stopped needing to fill it. Boone followed 2 lengths back with the secondary documents Margaret had asked for, writing with his characteristic economy of movement and expression. They stopped once at midday. Clara ate without tasting the food and went over the sequence of events in her mind, the way she'd been going over it for 3 days, the dates, the names, the chain of decisions that connected Ferris inside the bank to Whitfield in the field, to Graves in the valley, to the man at the top she still didn't have a name for. Margaret had said there was a name. Margaret had said the federal commissioner already knew it from another investigation. Margaret had said that by the time Clara sat in that office, the structure would be clear enough that her testimony was the final piece, not the whole picture. She hoped Margaret was right. She had found over the past 3 months that Margaret Fitch was right about most things she stated with confidence and wrong about nothing. She'd stated with certainty, which was a better record than almost anyone Clara had ever dealt with. "You're going over it again," Nathan said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the easy attention he always had. "I want it exact," she said. "It is exact," he said. "You wrote it out twice. Margaret reviewed it both times." "I know." "Clara." She looked at him. "You've been carrying the accuracy of this case like it's personal," he said. "It is personal. But you've also built a solid case with a good attorney and federal attention that came because the evidence warranted it. At some point you have to trust the structure you built." She looked at the road ahead. "I trust the evidence," she said. "It's people I have more trouble with." "I know," he said. "You've told me that without saying it every day since I met you." She glanced at him. "And yet you're still here." "And yet?" He agreed with the quiet steadiness that was so specifically him that she'd stopped being startled by it. They rode on. Margaret met them at the Federal Land Commissioner's building at 9 the following morning. She looked exactly as she had at the kitchen table, precisely assembled, sharply present, carrying the same satchel that now held enough documentation to take down a scheme that had been running for at least 4 years across 2 territories. She shook Clara's hand at the door and said, "The commissioner is Daniel Marsh. He's honest. He came up through the Marshal's service, which means he understands that evidence matters more than status. Don't let his manner put you off. He's brusque but fair." "I can work with brusque and fair," Clara said. "I know," Margaret said. "That's why I told you." The Federal Land Commissioner's office was 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of a stone building that smelled of paper and boot leather, and the particular institutional dryness of places where serious things happen routinely. Daniel Marsh was 60 broad through the chest, with a gray beard and the direct assessing gaze of a man who had spent 30 years deciding whether people were telling the truth. He looked at Clara when she sat down across from his desk and said, "You're the ranch manager." "Yes," she said. "You found the lantern piece?" "Yes." "And you identified the coordinated dates in the bank correspondence?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "How old are you, Miss Calloway?" 26, she said. He made a sound that was not dismissive, more like a man recalibrating something. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything. Start at the beginning. Don't summarize, tell me." She told him everything. She started at the July afternoon when her father came home and said Nathan Holt's name, and she went through all of it in sequence. The first visit, the partnership agreement, the bank's procedural objection, Graves and Whitfield, the water line, the fire, the lantern piece, Boone's tracks, Ferris's history, with Western Consolidated Holdings, the coordinated dates. She spoke for 45 minutes without notes, because she had lived it, and it was exact in her memory, the way things are when they've cost you something. Marsh listened without interrupting. He made notes. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment, and then looked at her. "The lantern piece," he said. "The base style, did you note the manufacturer's mark?" She had not. She said so plainly. "Margaret did," Marsh said, and he almost smiled. "It's a Denver manufacturer, specific to commercial supply operations. The same brand was found at a fire site in Montana Territory 8 months ago." He paused. "Different property, same pattern." "How many properties?" Clara asked. 9 confirmed, Marsh said. "Your operation is the first where the owner retained counsel before the acquisition was completed and brought evidence of this quality to our office." He set down his pen. "Miss Calloway, the man running Western Consolidated Holdings, is named Gerald Sutton. He's a Denver financier with 3 legitimate businesses as cover. He's been under federal watch for 14 months, but until now we haven't had the documentary chain to connect him directly to the individual actions in the territories. What you've brought us, the coordinated dates, the Ferris connection, the lantern piece. Graves's cooperation completes that chain." The room was very quiet. "You already had him," Clara said. "We had the shape of him," Marsh said. "You gave us the substance." She absorbed that. "The Calloway property," she said. "The note, the legal status. The bank note is stayed pending federal proceedings. The restructuring terms your attorney negotiated are reinstated as of this morning." He looked at her steadily. "Your land is not at risk, Miss Calloway. I want you to hear that clearly." She heard it. She sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle. "And Arlen?" she asked. "The territorial judge." "Under formal review," Marsh said. "He won't be ruling on anything in this territory for the foreseeable future." She nodded once. "What do you need from me going forward?" "Signed testimony, which Margaret will finalize. Availability for follow-up questions as the Sutton prosecution develops." He paused. "And Miss Calloway, the water resource on your North Ridge. The Federal Land Office would like to conduct its own hydrological assessment with your consent. The underground water source may have implications for the broader territory's drought management planning." She had not expected that. "You're asking for access, not ownership," she said carefully. "Access only," he said. "The resource remains yours. We want the data." She looked at him. "I'll need that in writing." He almost smiled fully this time. Margaret told me you'd say that, he said. It's already drafted. She signed the testimony in Margaret's office that afternoon. Nathan waited outside, which she had asked him to do, because she wanted this to be entirely and unambiguously her own act, her words, her account, her signature on the document that put her name on the side of the truth she'd spent 3 months fighting for. When she came out of the office, he stood up from the bench where he'd been waiting and looked at her face and said, "Done." "Done," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I can breathe differently," she said. "I didn't know I'd been breathing wrong until just now." He nodded slowly. "That's what the end of a long fight feels like," he said. "I recognize it." They ate dinner that evening, the three of them. Nathan, Clara, and Margaret at a restaurant on the main street of Cheyenne that had white tablecloths and food that was better than anything the ranch pantry had produced in months. Margaret ordered wine and poured 3 glasses and lifted hers and said, "To the people who do the work that makes the case worth making." Clara drank to that. She sat at a table with a white cloth in a restaurant in Cheyenne in her best dress. The gray one, the only good one, the one with the mended hem and the plain cuffs. And she looked at what the last 3 months had built and felt something she recognized from her grandfather's stories about the early years when her grandfather had looked at the land he'd broken and thought, "This is real. This is mine. Not because of paper, because of everything I've given it." She felt that now. Not about the land this time, about herself. They rode home on a Friday. Boone went ahead to open the ranch, and Clara and Nathan took the longer road back, which added 2 hours and went along the ridge line and through the upper valley, where the grass was turning from summer yellow toward the first tentative green that meant the heat was finally breaking. They talked the whole way. Not about the investigation, or the property, or the legal proceedings, about other things. About her grandfather's stories of breaking the first ground. About Nathan's first winter alone in the mountain ranch after his family was gone, and what it had taught him. About the kind of life each of them had built from the specific materials their losses had left them, and what it looked like from the inside. She told him things she had not told anyone. He told her the same. Not all at once, in the natural way of 2 people discovering that the other one is safe to tell the truth, to which is one of the rarest findings a person can make. At one point she said, "I don't know how to not be the one who carries everything." "I know," he said. "I've watched you carry it." "That doesn't solve it." "No," he said. "But you don't have to solve it today." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you've been the only one holding this for a long time," he said. "It's a habit built from necessity. Habits built from necessity take time to rebuild." He paused. "I'm not asking you to change overnight. I'm asking you to notice when you're carrying something alone that doesn't have to be carried alone. And if I'm not good at noticing, then I'll tell you," he said. "And you'll tell me I'm wrong, and I'll wait, and eventually you'll notice yourself." She looked at the road. "That sounds like a significant amount of patience on your end." "I've been patient with mountain winters," he said. "I think I can manage." She turned and looked at him full on, and he was looking back at her with the complete, unhurried attention that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him, and that still 3 months later she hadn't fully gotten used to. "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "I told you in Cheyenne I'd answer your question." "You did," he said. "How am I?" She paused. "I'm better than I've been in years, not because the problem is solved, because I know what I'm made of now. I wasn't sure before." She held his gaze. "And I know what you're made of, which is the more important finding." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara, don't say something careful," she said. "You've been careful for 3 months, I've noticed." Something crossed his face. "You're asking me not to be careful." "I'm asking you to say what you mean," she said, "the way you asked me to, from the beginning." He looked at her for a long moment on the road home, with the autumn light coming across the valley at an angle that turned everything it touched into something worth keeping. "I love you," he said. "That's what I mean." 3 words. Flat and simple, and completely without decoration, the way Nathan Holt said things that were entirely true. She felt them land. She had not expected at 26, wearing a mended dress and riding a gray mare, and coming home from signing federal testimony, to feel what she felt in that moment, not swept away, not overwhelmed, but grounded. More herself, not less. As though the words had not changed anything, but had named something that had already been there long enough to have set down roots. "I know," she said. "You know," he repeated. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to." He stared at her for a moment. "You were waiting for me to say it." "I was waiting for you to be ready to say it," she said. "There's a difference." "Clara Calloway," he said, and the way he said her name, like it was something he'd been turning over in his hands for months, and had finally decided to keep, made her feel something she had no clean word for, and didn't need one. "Yes," she said. "I should have said it sooner." "You said it when you meant it," she said. "That's the right time." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand briefly, the way he did everything without theater, without self-consciousness, just the true thing done simply. Then the trail narrowed, and they had to ride single file, and she went ahead, and she heard him behind her, and felt the particular quality of the afternoon around her, and thought that this exactly was what her grandfather had meant about the land, and the people who loved it long enough. You stopped being separate from it at some point. It became you, and you became it, and then one day you looked up and found someone else standing in the same ground, and you understood without having to explain it. They reached the ranch at late afternoon. Boone had the gate open. Violet came out of the house and looked at them both, and looked at Clara's face, and said nothing, which meant Violet understood more than she usually showed. Gerald came onto the porch and watched them ride in, and then looked at Nathan, and then looked at Clara, and cleared his throat. "Good trip," he said. "Federal commissioner accepted the testimony," Clara said, dismounting. "The investigation is active. The note is cleared. The land is ours." Gerald put both hands on the porch rail and held it for a moment. Then he said in a voice that had gone rough at the edges, "Your grandfather would have been—" He stopped, started again. "He would have been proud." Clara led June to the barn and stood in the quiet for a moment with her mare and her hands and the smell of hay and the particular peace of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She heard Nathan's boots behind her. "Leave the horses," he said. "Boone's got them. I always put June up myself." "Boone already has her," he said. "Come sit on the porch for 10 minutes. You've been moving for 3 days." She turned around. He was standing in the barn doorway with his arms folded and the late afternoon behind him, looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the first day, like he had time for the actual seeing, like she was worth the patience of a full look. 10 minutes, she said. 10 minutes, he agreed. They sat on the porch steps. Violet brought out 2 cups of coffee without being asked and went back inside without a word, which was more grace than Clara usually credited her sister with. Gerald disappeared somewhere that was tactfully away. The valley was going gold and long-shadowed, the way it did at the end of summer afternoons, and the water in the south pasture trough was running clear from the north ridge spring, and the cattle in the east pasture were moving slowly and calmly, the way cattle do when they're watered and content, and the fence lines were straight, and the barn was sound and everything her grandfather had broken the first ground for was still standing. "I want to talk about the winter operation," Clara said. Nathan turned and looked at her. "Not right now," she said. "But soon. The cattle numbers need to be up before first frost if we're going to show recovery for the partnership review. I've been working through the grazing rotation, and I think if we—" "Clara," she stopped. 10 minutes, he said. "Just sit for 10 minutes." She looked at him. He looked back. There was a warmth in his face that was entirely unguarded, the face of a man who had stopped being careful because the person across from him had told him it was all right to stop. "All right," she said. She sat. The valley settled into evening around them, and the light went the way. Summer light goes at the end of August, slowly, beautifully, like something that knows its time but isn't in a hurry. And Clara Calloway, who had spent 4 years being the invisible one, the practical one, the one who held everything together, while everyone else talked about what should happen to the land. She worked with her own hands, sat on the porch of her family's home, with the evidence of her own competence laid out across the valley in water lines and clear troughs and recovered cattle counts, and let herself be exactly where she was. Not managing it. Not planning the next thing. Just here. 3 weeks later, Margaret sent a letter. Gerald Sutton had been arrested in Denver. Ferris and Whitfield were cooperating with the federal prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. Judge Arlen had resigned his position rather than face formal proceedings. The First Territorial Bank's local operation was under federal oversight, and the loan officers who had participated in the procedural obstruction scheme had been relieved of their positions. 7 of the 9 affected properties in Wyoming and Montana had been contacted by the federal land office. The owners, most of them small ranchers who had been on the edge of losing everything, were being offered the debt restructuring they'd been denied. 2 properties had already been sold under duress, and the federal investigation was examining whether those transactions could be unwound. At the bottom of the letter in Margaret's precise handwriting, she had added, "You are the reason this happened, Miss Calloway. Not the only reason, but the first reason. The case began when you decided the pattern was worth understanding, and the truth was worth the work of proving it. That is not common. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Clara read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the ledger, the one she kept under the floorboard in her room, the one that held the real numbers and the real account of everything. She put Margaret's letter there because it belonged with the things that were true. On the first Saturday of September, Nathan came to find her on the North Ridge. She was checking the headgate the way she did twice a week, her hands working the fittings with the practiced efficiency of a person who has done a thing enough times to do it without thinking. She heard him on the trail and turned when he was close. I was not wearing his riding coat. He was in his work shirt, the one she'd seen him in on the ridge during the water line construction, worn at the elbows and clean. He was holding his hat in both hands. She knew what that meant. She'd learned him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. He paused. "You know?" "I've known it was coming for 2 weeks," she said. "You've been working up to it." He looked at her with that expression that was somewhere between exasperation and something much warmer. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me," she said. He came and stood in front of her with the valley behind him and the morning sun on his face and his hat in his hands, and he said, "I want to build something with you. Not a business arrangement. Not a partnership agreement." He paused. "A life. This land, this work, this place with you in it. I want that. I want you to want that." Clara looked at Nathan Holt and thought about a gray dress and a parlor, and a man who had looked at her when she expected to be looked past. She thought about 3 months of hard work and a ridge fire and a federal summons and the specific quality of silence between 2 people who have stopped needing to fill it. She thought about her grandfather's voice. "You find the people who stand in the same ground as you, and you hold on." "I don't need saving," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not offering to save you. I'm asking to stand next to you." "I make decisions independently," she said. "I know that too. I'm counting on it." "I will always put this land first," she said. "It's not a failing. It's who I am." "It's one of the things I love most about you," he said. "It's not a condition, it's a fact. I know the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. The water ran clean and cold through the pipe behind her. The valley lay below them in the early September light, beginning to turn from summer's end toward the first color of autumn. "Yes," she said. He held very still. "Yes. Yes," she said again. "I want that. I have wanted it for longer than I've been willing to say, which you probably already knew." "I suspected," he said. "Don't be smug about it." "I'm not smug," he said. "I'm relieved." She laughed. It surprised her, the full, unguarded sound of it coming up before she could moderate it, and it surprised him too, because his face opened into the complete version of the almost smile she'd been cataloging for 3 months. The real one. The one that changed everything about how he looked. She reached out and took his hand the way he'd taken hers on the road from Cheyenne briefly. Simply the true thing done without theater. He held on. They were married in October. The church was the same white building on the main street of Harrow Flats, with the pew her grandfather had built with his own hands, and the congregation that came was the congregation that had watched Clara Calloway be invisible for 26 years, and then watched her save a ridge fire, and then watched her take a scheme apart, piece by piece, until the federal government noticed, and they came in. The way people come when they understand they are witnessing something that mattered and matters still. Walt Purcell sat in the third row. Boone sat beside him, narrow-shouldered and correct in a clean shirt, looking exactly as he always looked, like a man who is exactly where he's supposed to be and has no opinion about anyone who finds that remarkable. Violet cried. She did it beautifully, the way Violet did everything with a handkerchief she'd embroidered herself, and the knowledge that being moved was not a weakness. Gerald Calloway walked his daughter down the aisle of the church his father-in-law had built, and when he took her hand to give it to Nathan's, he held it for one extra moment and looked at her and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. He said, "He sees you, Clara. He always saw you." She heard it. She kept her chin up and her eyes clear, and she thought about gray dresses and mended hems and 26 years of being the invisible one. And she understood that the end of invisibility is not a single moment. It is an accumulation, every small decision to speak when you might have been quiet. Every time you held someone's gaze instead of looking away. Every morning, you got back on the horse and rode the fence line, even though no one was watching, and no one would have known if you hadn't. You make yourself visible by living as though you are worth being seen. And then one day, the right person looks. On a morning in November, Clara rode the North Ridge, the way she rode it twice a week, checking the head gate, listening to the water in the pipe, reading the land, the way her grandfather had taught her before she was old enough to know she was learning. Nathan rode beside her. He had learned her route, the way he learned everything she showed him. Quietly, completely, with the patience of a man who understands that some knowledge belongs to a place and must be absorbed from it directly, not summarized from someone else's account. At the top of the ridge, they stopped. The valley below them was in its full autumn colors, the grass gone gold, and the cottonwoods turned yellow along the creek line, and the ranch buildings clear and small in the distance, and the south pasture trough gleaming where the water from the North Ridge spring still ran steady and clean. "Your grandfather was right," Nathan said. "About the land remembering water," she said. "About that," he said. "And about the people who stay long enough." He looked at the valley. "You can't buy what you built here. You can only earn it." Clara Calloway Holt looked at the land her grandfather had broken, and her father had held, and that she had fought for through a hard summer with burned hands and a gray dress and a clarity about what mattered that had never once failed her when she needed it. "I know," she said. She looked at Nathan beside her, at the man who had ridden 3 days from the mountains to look at a piece of land and had found unexpectedly something worth more than land. She had found the same thing. Not a rescue, not a resolution handed to her by someone with more power, but a partnership, real, documented, tested by fire and drought and fraud, and the specific difficulty of two people who had both learned to carry everything alone, deciding together to try something different. She had worn a gray dress with a mended hem to meet her father's guest, and she had walked into that parlor expecting nothing, and she had ended up with everything that mattered. Not because she had been saved, because she had been seen and had been at last exactly who she was. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.